Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be focusing upon a very important relationship, and that is between China and Latin America, really, and the Caribbean, both geographical entities. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Enrique Dussel Peters has a Ph.D. in economics at the University of Notre Dame, and he is a professor at the Graduate School of Economics at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México since 1993. He's a coordinator of the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies at the School of Economics at UNAM and of the Academic Network of Latin America and the Caribbean on China. His most recent book is Latin America, China, and Great Power Competition. Professor, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's start off with this is an extremely timely book, very important book. Why is this relationship so important today between China, Latin America, and the Caribbean?
Look, I would say in general and qualitative terms, in the book we highlight and examine details on quantitative issues, but I would say a little bit jokingly, but with a lot of seriously, let's imagine a day today in Latin America without China. So Latin Americans would walk barefoot without underwear. Telecommunications like this program, we could not have it. Ports and airports would not work, etc. So in the 21st century, the relationship, the socioeconomic relationship has increased dramatically.
It certainly has, no doubt about it. Well, excuse me, we have a very difficult situation developing now with the relationship between China, Latin America, the United States, and Canada, and large parts of the world. How is Mexico dealing with this?
Well, I believe in the last 5-10 years, and since January 20th of 2025, third countries have been dealing with difficulties in this new triangular relationship. No, so we are witnessing today a full blow and full house and full Monty confrontation between the U.S. and China. And one of the challenges is for third regions such as Latin America, but also Africa, Asia, and third countries from Vietnam, Germany to Mexico, how to deal on hundreds of issues, from 6G to Confucius Institutes, investments, semiconductors, electric vehicles, etc., etc. It's a very dynamic relationship that is evolving in 2025 daily. From day to day, we are witnessing news regarding tariffs, regarding exemptions, regarding topics on tourism, etc., etc.
Exactly, we certainly are. And let me mention your website before I forget it. It's www.dusselpeters.com, and our viewers can go to that to get more information about what we're talking about today. Well, we're in a situation now. It seemed as though a year ago we were moving along very nicely. The immigration situation was improving on the border. That's always been a very testy point between the United States and Mexico for various reasons. And then all of a sudden we had an election, and now we've got a totally different situation. It's instead of a cooperative relationship, it's an adversarial relationship, it seems like, with not only Mexico, but China, I mentioned Canada, Panama, the European Union, and just a variety of other places around the world. It seems that the situation between Mexico and China is a little better, and between Mexico and the United States than it is than some of the other countries. Is that due to your current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, or what do we attribute that to?
Look, in the book, I attempt to go beyond the descriptive trap No, today we have lots of topics in trade. We have gigas of information, and so in May, some exports fall from Mexico to the U.S. and they increase to China, and we could go on and put to sleep anybody. No, the challenge is to go beyond this descriptive trap, to propose a group of concepts in order to allow for a more or less methodological discussion on these topics. No? So in the case of Mexico and this new triangular relationship between the US, China, and Mexico, but you have lots, hundreds of other triangular relationships with Vietnam, with Belize, with Panama, Brazil, etc. I would highlight that Mexico and the US, we share a 3,000 and plus kilometers border. We have had lots of different phases in the relationship in the last centuries between the US and Mexico. It has been, we have had better times. Now we are in a very uncertain period since January 20th, and with lots of tensions. And again, this changes from day to day, from migration to fentanyl to tomatoes and water. No, welcome to very detailed discussions. But again, in which what we are witnessing is a very difficult and tense situation between the U.S. and China, and in which people and authors such as Robert Lighthizer in this year, I think one of the few thinkers of the White House today, has been highlighting that in the short term, the US will finish with the world order as we know it since 1944 with the so-called Bretton Woods institutions. And in the short term, the attempt of the US would be to generate and create a small group of friendly countries with the US and to challenge this competition and systemic competition with China. We are witnessing today two different political systems, two different economic systems between the US and China. And the challenge, among others, is how will behave third countries, such as Mexico.
Exactly. And for decades, really almost 80 years, this structure, now I think most people are in agreement that the Bretton Woods structure needs to be revamped. It needs to be reformed a bit. It's not the same as it was in the 1940s, and it absolutely must be changed to some degree. But what we're viewing today is a destruction of that order. And with this destruction comes a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability and fear that countries cannot rely on other countries to do certain things. For example, the United States has been the leader really around the world, whether it liked it or not, in most areas and needed to provide some leadership. Today, we're talking, many of these countries are saying, well, we can't rely on the United States. Let's leave the US out. Many of the Asian countries are looking to Vietnam or to China to develop relationships. Europeans are. They're saying leadership going forward without the United States. Is that feasible? How dangerous is that?
This could be one of the results of this inflationary executive orders since January 20th of this year. No, I think there is an impatience, a political impatience in Washington, trying to change socioeconomic trade investment relationships with Latin America, but also with Europe, with China. And it could be that the main country that benefits from these executive orders is China. The problem, Bill, I humbly believe, and this is one of the topics of the book, the problem is that there is not a sufficient understanding in Washington and by the so-called think tanks in DC. I am in many times very critical of these think tanks. I say jokingly, neither think nor tanks, but we call them think tanks. I have been there. I've been teaching and publishing in these think tanks. I know them very well. But the problem is that there is no sufficient understanding of the depth of China's presence and of this new triangular relationship. In the 21st century, Bill, China's presence has increased dramatically. And in the case of Mexico, for example, imagine that we are massively importing parts and components from China, but the main importer firms in Mexico are mainly US American firms, no? So General Motors imports massively cars made in China, parts and components from China that are being sold. The final product is a car called, which says made in Mexico, and this is being sold in Mexico, but also in the United States. So this industrial structure has been generated for 20 plus years, and you will not change it in a weekend, independently of this political impatience in Washington, no?
Exactly. And we're going to come back in just a moment to talk about that. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions on Global Connection are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just like our shows, you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking about the relationship between China and Latin America and the Caribbean, but also between the United States and really the rest of the world. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Enrique Dussel Peters is a professor at the Graduate School of Economics at the Universidad Nacional, Autónoma de México since 1993. His most recent book is titled Latin America, China, and Great Power Competition. Dr. Peters, we've talked about the dissolution of the Bretton Woods institutions, which is really, they've had their problems, but they have prevented World War III. They've basically set up the trading order that is not totally, maybe not as fair as some people would like it, but still it has worked. And it's also delivered a lot of prosperity to various countries around the world. I'm sure you found that in your economic studies, that almost all of the economists that I've seen the reports, except for the ones who are developing the economics studies and developing economic programs in Washington have seen. But how, as we look at this destruction, and a lot of people say it's totally needless, it's just uncalled for. And as you mentioned, when companies go into areas, they're going to come in. You can't build an automobile plant in 6 weeks. It just does not work. It's absolutely not going to happen. And it's just fantasy to think that this is a way you can go forward. But as we've been watching this needless destruction and really the weakening, according to a large number of experts, a weakening of the United States. A lot of the experts now say the U.S. is not the number one country in the world. A lot of them are saying China is number one. And the one country that's really encouraging us to do a lot of this reckless behavior is Russia. Russia's wanted to see the dissolution of NATO. They wanted to see the weakening of the U.S. How is this viewed from Mexico City?
Well, again, this conflict between the US and China is generating massive uncertainty all over the world, in Latin America and the Caribbean, Also, in US firms, again, I highlight that the relationship between Latin America and Mexico does not question the relationship with the United States. Very clearly, the United States is the main point of reference in terms of trade, investment, firms, but also culture and tourism and many other issues. But what we are witnessing in the 21st century is that there is a newcomer, China, and that we have to deal with it. No, so the U.S. has been trying since the Biden administration. I remind you, in 2022, three important laws regarding research and development infrastructure, among others, spending 15%, 15% of US GDP in terms of trying to counter China in terms of innovation productivity. I think this is a correct way to go. But what we are witnessing today are very short and quick measures attempting to go beyond China, attempting to change this global order. And as we know, and as you mentioned a moment ago, these innovation systems, these productive systems, global value chains, plans, etc., they take decades. No, so what we have today in 2025 is the result of decades of firms and global value chains that have been generating globally. And I very humbly believe that such short-term measures will have enormous impacts, particularly in US firms. No, many of them established in Mexico, in Brazil, in Argentina, and in China, by the way. No.
Mhm. Most assuredly. You were talking about the think tanks, and as you mentioned, there are a lot of them in Washington that neither think nor are they tanks. They just really, you wonder where they come from, and you wonder where some of their philosophy comes from. But one of the, according to a large number of people who study this, one of the major offenders is a Heritage Foundation. If you could sit down with the leader of the Heritage Foundation or the guy who main architect of Project 2025, who's now, I believe, the OMB director in Washington, what suggestions would you make to give them suggestions on how to deal with maybe some of the legitimate concerns they have? And some of their concerns are legitimate, but a large number of them are pretty fanciful, according to the experts. But what would you recommend to them?
Well, I would recommend them to read the chapter of the book regarding institutions in China, in Latin America, in the US that have been examining this new triangular relationship, China, the US, and Latin America, to see a brief evaluation of the institutions in Washington, but also in Beijing and in Latin America, and particularly to engage and to integrate to the already ongoing debates and discussions in Latin America and China on these issues. In many cases, and very respectfully, I say it, there is some kind of autism of these institutions and of these think tanks. They simply do not read what is being discussed by business organizations, by the public sector in Latin America and in China. And in many cases, they are publishing in 2024, 2025 reports that are completely outdated in terms of information, in terms of proposals, policy proposals. So the audience in Washington, no, the different kinds of audiences that you have, are ill-informed, no? And so policymakers are taking ill-informed policies and decisions. This is a pity, to put it politely and diplomatically, no?
And diplomatically, that's very true. Very true, yes. Well, a lot of the historians are saying we are repeating 100 years later many of the same activities and many of the same mistakes were repeated 100 years ago. I won't go through all of them. We can talk about the transformation of America to a more autocratic, fascistic country. We can talk about the what led up to World War II. But I've been reading about these rare earth minerals that China has that are extremely important to the United States and to manufacturers all around the world for their computer products or whatever, for their cars.
Electronic.
And if we electronics, right? And if China now decides to withhold that, that reminds me of back during right before World War II, where the U.S. put an embargo on Japan, and we went into World War II. Do you see a link there? I hope I'm wrong, but it seems to me we're making the same ignorant mistakes we made 100 years ago or better. But how do you view that?
Well, the case you mentioned and the example of rare materials and minerals that you highlight is a good example of how these institutions, but also public officials and business organizations and firms in the United States, they have noticed the trend of China several decades too late. No? So what we are witnessing is that for 20 plus years, Chinese firms, Chinese public firms have been massively acquiring in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, particular minerals. No, we see the case, for example, of lithium, which is the basis for lithium batteries, for electric vehicles, and many other products today. In the case of Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, they are all in the hands of Chinese firms. But they have been acquiring these firms and these lithium reserves since 15 years ago, and few people, not to say nobody, noticed it. And so suddenly in 2024, 2025, you are, how is this possible? Why didn't anybody inform me? Why are we so far behind these technological and innovation trends? No? So it's a good example of this informative resources and think tanks that have not been doing their homework. No, one of the results of the book is we have to strengthen the institutions all over in the US, in China, and in Latin America to have a better communication and coordination.
That's exactly right. And you've hit on a very important point. That is, China is using soft power to achieve a lot of its foreign policy goals and domestic goals. The United States, we've relied so much on hard power, the military, that type of thing. But this has been happening for years with the Belt and Road Initiative that China launched, that multi-billion-dollar operation, basically halfway around the world, I think, or maybe all the way around the world. Now, there were problems with it, and they got a lot of flap back on it. But the point is that they've been pursuing their goals peacefully and quietly, whereas we have been not doing quite the same thing. But we've only have 30 seconds left. But how do you think the dismantling of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, which was a soft power program that was extremely successful, it was less than 1% of our national budget, made us millions of friends around the world, saved millions of lives in 30 seconds. How is that helping us by eliminating AID?
I very humbly believe this is not the most intelligent decision. No, institutions, these soft power institutions, should become part of a strategy of the United States, and you should keep these institutions and reinforce them with a particular strategy instead of eliminating them completely.
Exactly. If there are problems, and there probably were problems with AID, you don't go in and just eliminate an agency. It's like if you owned a business and you came in, you fired everybody, you closed the doors, and you said, now I think I'll see what's wrong with the business. That is not how we would do it. But Dr. Enrique Peters is an extremely important topic, and I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.